Welcome to Kicks and Minivans, the podcast for dads who love sneakers. I'm your host, KG. However you're watching and listening, man, we appreciate you tuning in, joining us, hanging out with us for a little bit. Well, we are on the third straight episode with an interview, and so I'm so excited. I hope you guys have been enjoying the content lately. With Red on a couple episodes ago, Salim on. Last episode for Salim's Hot Takes. I had a lot of fun with that one. This week we are joined by a friend and mentor and a pastor of mine, Marc Lucenius. He's not my current pastor, but he's someone that will always be a pastor to me. He is the founding and lead pastor of 938 Church, formerly known as Project 938. He started that in 2018, February 2018, and I joined staff to partner with him later in 2018 as the kids and youth director there. And so I got to work closely with him for 2 years until we left to move out here to Indiana. I learned so much from him while I was working with him about life, about leadership, about loving God and loving people and loving the family well. And he does all of those things really well. He's, like I said, he will always be a pastor and a mentor to me. And so I'm excited and thrilled for you guys to be able to hear from him as well. So let's jump into it. Welcome, Marc Lucenius. All right, Marc, thanks for joining Kicks and Minivans. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, KG, or Kevin, as most people know you.
We go by either, you know. So give us a little snapshot of Marc with a C. Give us a little snapshot of Marc. Tell us about your family, who you are, what you do.
Sure. My family consists of Kathleen, my wife, who works in the school district as a paraprofessional. And we have 3 kids. Kelsey is 21, Hannah is 19, and my son Sam is 16. And they are in various levels of college and high school, and they've always been a lot of fun to watch play sports and grow up and walk with the Lord. I'm a pastor at a local church called 938 Church. We planted in 2018. We called it, at that time, Project 938. Then when the pandemic happened, we say we planted Pandemic 938. And but during that time, we were out of a building for about 18 months, and we came back as 938 Church. So I got my shirt, sporting the shirt. Community, faith, compassion is our values.
Yeah, that's and that was around the same time, 6 months or so into the pandemic, is when I left staff.
Yeah.
So I never do it as 938 Church. It was always Project 938 to me when I was a part of it. So yeah, I mean, like, you guys went through so much transition, and I know of a lot of churches that just didn't make the transition through COVID. And so even just the fact that, I know it's a very different church than when I was there, you know, pre-2020, but
Sure.
The fact that you're still there and still moving and still doing things is like just a great testament to the leadership there and God's goodness and grace, and what you guys are called to do there in Westchester.
Yeah, it's a blessing to see God continue to work to change lives, and generally speaking, starting with me.
Yeah. And I've gotten to know your family well, man. I love your kids. I've gotten to know each of your kids in, like, you know, unique different ways. Both Kelsey and Hannah volunteered with kids while I was there. Sam the man, he was not taller than me when I left. I was still blocking his shot on the basketball court when I left. I don't think that would happen anymore.
Nah, he's over an inch taller than me. He's an inch taller than me these days. Over 6'3".
You got a couple on me. So I skipped town right in time. I could still bully him on the court a little bit. So I skipped out before the tables turned there for me. Yeah. So.
Well, I love my kids and love sports, and so it's a few things better than watching my kid play sports and playing with them. You know?
Yeah. That's like life goal of mine. Is like I want to stay active enough to be able to, like, you know, play basketball or whatever sports my kids are into. Like, hope it's not soccer, but like I'll get into it if that's what they like, you know. And so hey, I want to be like active enough that when they're in their teens and early 20s that I can get out there and participate with them a little bit, you know.
One of my favorite achievements of this year is achieving the role of batting practice pitcher for his baseball
There
team.
you go. There you go.
Kept the shoulder loose enough through the years. And when I pitched back in the day, it wasn't much better than batting practice then. So I just was able to keep it going and feel like I was a part of not just watching the team, but being with the team. And that was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah. You just got to be able to throw it over the plate, when you're the batting practice coach. You just got to be able to get it relatively in there, So that's really special to be able to participate like that with the kids. So this is Kicks and Minivans, so we always talk sneakers. So are you a big sneaker guy?
Generally speaking, no, but I'm getting there. With your help and Sam's help. So I'm coming along. I'm going to disappoint you today. I'm wearing Birkenstocks, right? So that's
okay, man.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
they have a cult following. The Birkenstocks do. Like they really do.
Yeah, I'm not in the cult, but I do have some granola in me. So my favorite sneaker purchase of the year was for Christmas. Kathleen got me some new hiking shoes that were Gore-Tex. I went on a hiking trip a couple summers ago with some guys, and it was, there was a lot of water, mud. I just saw guys in front of me just walk right through the water. I said, I want to do that. And so this time now I have the Gore-Tex sneakers. I took them on the big hiking trip just 2 weeks ago. And right before we get to the top of the mountain, it just starts raining, raining hard. And we have 4 hours to go to get to the bottom. And it just keeps raining and raining, raining. We're going down these trails, which are essentially riverbeds. I got 3 inches washing through my Gore-Tex sneakers. The only waterproofing those Gore-Tex sneakers were doing by middle of that hike was keeping the water in my shoes. I was glad to have the Gore-Tex shoes. But when it comes to sneakers, my hope is to, my goal is to get some Air Jordans. And I was thinking, you had asked at some point, what my favorite sneaker is going to be. I'd love to see an Air Jordan, with the Sixers colors, red and blue. So the low tops. I think the Air Jordan Low 1. Am I getting the title right there?
Yep. That's
not crazy. Not crazy. What are you wearing these days?
But a little bit of everything. I definitely got some ones. Ones is probably the most of the same model that I have. I'm not a big low top person personally. I tend to go for, more of the mid to high top. That said, I got the Air Force One low tops. This is the only pair of Air Force Ones that I have. But they're more of a low top. But I love the lows, just not my particular style. But they got lots of great colorways in the lows. But yeah, I'm with you, man. You get some Sixers ones that you could wear to the game. You could wear them with the Phillies uniforms too. Philadelphia is, they're all about the red right now. And the green, we love our Eagles too. It's a good time to be a Philly fan. I'm just representing from a couple states away, but we still got love for all of it.
Do they have any Kelly Green Air Jordans on the horizon, do you think? Kelly Green.
I don't know if there's any coming out soon. I do have a pair of Jordan 13s that's white with the Kelly Green. And I think they're marketed as the Celtics green, which I just ignore that. We don't call it that, but this past January and February, I wore those almost every day. Cause it was Eagles, man. We were in the playoffs. We were making that Super Bowl push. And so I had, a couple pair of all my green sneakers just got worn like crazy, but those Jordan 13s in particular with the Kelly Green. So now I got to get me a Kelly Green jersey or hoodie or something. I don't have any Kelly Green Eagles gear, and so I got to get something to wear with those.
What player? What player? Who do you want on the back?
If I know it wasn't really his time, I would love to get me a Dawkins jersey. Brian Dawkins. If I'm going with a Kelly Green though, I'd probably go Reggie White. Just because I feel like when you think Kelly Green, you either think him or Cunningham.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I really started following the Eagles. I was about 10 years old, so around 2000. And so Brian Westbrook was my favorite player growing up. I would love to get a Westbrook jersey. You know, obviously I love Dawkins as well. He's one of the most legendary Eagles players of all time. But yeah, I gotta get me a little Eagles Kelly Green in my wardrobe to go with those sneakers. But yeah, I gotta share this story with you because it's you know, we're talking kicks. When I was on staff with you still, when we moved to the virtual, you know what story I'm about to tell?
I think so. Yeah, I didn't know if you were going to tell it. I was going to tell it, but I want to hear you say it.
So this was like, I had to give so much props to you because you brought this to us in a staff meeting, and I was like, I know exactly what he's doing, but I'm going along with it anyway. Mark needed a new pair of shoes. And, you know, for a sneakerhead, when we decide, we never need a new pair of shoes because we have so many. But, you know, when we go out to buy a new pair of shoes, like it's an experience, you know, and we know exactly what we're going to get. Mark, he's just like, I just need a new pair of shoes. Yeah. But I don't know what to get. I don't know what to look for. So he's like, I got 2 sneaker guys on my staff. So I'm going to pose this as a competition to them. And so he brought it to staff meeting. Me and Josh were on staff. Josh has been on this podcast. He's a huge sneakerhead. One of the few guys I know that has more sneakers than me. And so he brings it to staff meeting. He's like, hey, I need a new pair of shoes. Winner gets like a virtual high five from me because we're in COVID. We're not seeing each other. Here's my budget, and I want it to be blue. And like, that was it. And me and Josh took this so seriously. And Rachel's like, I want to play too. We're like, sure, whatever. And me and Josh took this so seriously, sent you like, what, 4 or 5 recommendations each with like a full type out on all of them and everything.
Yeah, it was like PowerPoint presentations. And...
But I was like, immediately I was like, oh, we're doing his shopping for him.
Oh, yeah.
But like, I respect the move so much that I'm going with it, you know?
Oh, yeah. And KG, you're the guy who won. With much protest. But I chose your sneaker, and I wore that sneaker for a long time, man. So,
anyway. It was a great shoe for the price, especially, you know. Yeah, Josh wasn't happy about it because he felt like he was the Yoda, and I was like the young, you know, Skywalker. Yeah. But I told him it was like Iverson crossing Jordan at the top of the key. Like that was my you know, young AI up in. But, anyways, man. Yeah. Great to have you on, man. We've spent a lot of time working together, so great to have you joining us in this context to talk with us. Now, I don't want to get into your age. I'm not going to ask you your age, but you know, you have kids. You're on the other side of parenting than I am. Yeah. I have a 3-year-old and 1-year-old in the house, so it's like you've been through everything I am going through right now, and so much more. And so this podcast, you know, we have some guys that listen that are in your age demographic, but most of the guys are in my phase of life. Somewhere between 25 and 40 years old, married, young kids in the house, elementary or younger. We heard a little bit about Mark now, church planner, kids in high school and college, doing sports with them, all that stuff. Tell us about Mark at my age. You know, I'm 32, about to be 33. You know, in that 25 to 35 window, like what was Mark like? Where were you at in your career, your family life at that age?
Lots of changes, and it felt like every couple of years there's new change, right? At age 25, Kathleen and I married, and we moved from Delaware up to Pennsylvania, where she was doing some grad school work, and I was in seminary, and then I switched seminaries, and then getting out of school and starting to work for a church, and then having a kid at the same time. And then having a second kid, and then like a third kid, and then looking at a new calling. All those things happened in that 25 to 35 range. And so in so many regards, it was like, you know, it was a lot of whiplash those first 10 years of marriage. We're trying to work and build a great marriage, but in so many ways, we're constantly rebuilding the structures of life, rebuilding the foundations. And like every time you feel like you got to figure it out, like the kid goes to a new phase or just another kid shows up, and you're like, it just feels like I'm just rebuilding that house of cards every 6 months, only to have, you know, some of those key cards at the bottom just swept underneath from me. And so getting some consistency and traction felt hard, But in many ways, that wasn't what life was about at that time. Life was about adapting and figuring it out together.
Do you feel like it's different now? Like, I feel like that's kind of my life, is it's like, I say all the time, life is just a series of figuring things out.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like that's just what life has been, especially since I graduated college, entered the workforce, moved out on my own, all those things. Like, life is just a series of figuring things out. It's like you figure one thing out and you have another thing that just presented itself. Do you feel like, where you're at now with the kids a little bit older, do you feel like it's still that whiplash effect, or do you feel like things kind of settled out? What's your experience like that?
I think when the kids are, in some ways before teenagers, kids is in the early years is very physically demanding. It's like you're not getting sleep, and they just have so much energy.
Preach.
And it's like there's just not enough of you to go around. And once you have three, it's like zone defense, and you're just holding on for your life physically. In that elementary to middle school years, it starts getting demanding mentally, because you're managing multiple schedules. Kids are staying up later. You have less time to huddle as a couple. You have less time to stay connected as a couple, because everything just starts moving really fast. And then the teenage years, actually, once they get to high school, they start managing some of their own things. Their stuff starts happening more at school and on their own time. And so it's like you get caught up, physically, even a little bit freed up mentally. But it's the emotional demands of, losing control of your kids, and seeing them change, seeing them begin responding to life in ways that I can't control. And so that's how I've seen the changes happen as I've come along. So we're still in the emotionally exhausting stage.
Sure. And I could totally see that.
Super fun.
Yeah. There's so many challenging things and fun things about every phase, and that physically exhausting thing, like I especially feel that today. Like yesterday, I woke up, had a great workout in the morning, and then, both kids usually wake up around 7. They were both up at 6. So I had just gotten out of the shower after my workout, and like by the time Becky got home from work, I'm like, they've been up for 12 hours, and I feel like I've been literally physically wrestling with them for 10 of them. Like, I just like they've just wanted to wrestle and roughhouse all day, and I'm wiped. I'm exhausted.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I've had 60 pounds of kids like crawling all over me all day, and I'm beat, man. But I could totally see, like, man, especially when you start getting into those middle school years, those teenage years, the mental and emotional exhaustion, I could see that taking over a little bit more.
Yeah, it's different. A friend of mine, I remember saying something like, man, I dread the teenage years. And I don't know what I was talking about when it came to that. And she just said, she's like, every stage has been better than the previous one. And I don't know if it's true, but I decided to believe that's true. And and trying that on has made a difference for me. And not every stage has been easy, but I really find more and more satisfaction in parenting at every stage.
Yeah. I think that's a great perspective. Like the Facebook memories and the Apple Photos memories will get you, right? They're like, hey, a year ago you took this picture. And when your kids are 2 and 3, a year is a massive difference. I'm like Jace is 3, and I see these pictures that pop up on Facebook. I'm like, he had a full head of curly hair. Like, he has no curls left anymore. I'm like, he's so different. And like, me and Becky will look at him, we're like, oh, I miss that Jace. I'm like, yeah, but I love this Jace. I love this Jace so much. Like, I can't imagine going back to that Jace, because I love this Jace so much. And 4-year-old Jace, I'm going to love in a completely different way. And so, I really try to look at it as, like, he's only 3 once.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm going to enjoy everything about 3-year-old Jace before he becomes 4-year-old Jace, because there's going to be new things to enjoy, because he can't do things now that he could do things now he couldn't do when he was 2. And he's just going to continue to learn and grow and adapt, and we're going to learn and grow and adapt with him. But there's beauty in every single phase. And if you just wish the phase away, man, you're missing something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So they say hindsight's 2020, right? So looking back when you were my age, that whole 25 to 35 window, man, it's like you go through so much change and transition, and I've gone through so much over these last couple years too. What are some things you feel like you did well in your 20s and 30s? Like, what are some things you look back on and you say, you know what, I wouldn't change how I handled that. I'm proud of the way that I handled that when I was in my 20s and 30s, whether that's career, life, family, whatever it is.
Sure. Every family is different, and people are different, and each person's role is different. But in the pastoral world, you tend to be available to people when people are available, right? Which tends to be, evenings, weekends, and things like that. And I made a decision early on, and Kathleen and I talked about this, that the hardest couple of hours of every day for her was between 5 and 7. And in my world, I was working with folks out in the main line, sort of the old wealthy area of the Philadelphia suburbs, and a lot of these men who I needed to spend time with, they were pretty busy and they worked long days, but they'd make themselves available in the mornings. And so I just made a commitment to be out the door early, either in the office or meeting with people early, like 7-ish, so that I could feel very comfortable to leave the office by 4:15, 4:30. I had a 45-minute commute home in those early years, just to and to commit to being there between 5 and 7. Now, not one or two nights a week, I'd have to be out again. But Kathleen's like, look, if you can be here by between 5 and 7, I don't care what you do the rest of the night. These are the hours that matter, because just like you're feeling like that physical exhaustion, she was as well, but not just her, the kids were as well. So they're at their worst when, in some ways, Kathleen was at her most spent. And so if I can get a little bit of transition time in the car to focus myself, and I would do that. I was pretty deliberate about that. I can come in with a fresh breath of energy to support for those few hours. And then each of us, after the kids got to bed, we were energized enough to spend time with each other.
Yeah. That's huge, especially in those early years. Bedtime can often be the best part of the day, but could also be the worst part of the day. It's like you get, the last couple nights, Corey's been waking up so early that, he takes his nap at like 9 because he's been getting up at like 6. He's getting his nap at like 9:30, which means he's up by 11 or 12, which means by bedtime, he is wild. Losing control. But then it's like, man, as soon as you take him in and you sit down in that rocking chair, he just passes out. And so it's like you get those baby snuggles with him, and that's great. But it's like, man, it's made such a huge difference. Becky transitioned to a new job at the start of this year where she's home for bed. She's home. She gets off work at 5:30 every day, so she's home by 5:45 every single day, and is there for the bedtime, bath time, all that kind of stuff, dinner.
It's huge.
Whereas she was working night shift, so she was out 3 nights a week at work. She was, leaving at the worst time of the day. And it's like the kids are upset to see her leave because she just slept all day, And so it's like now they're losing it because she's leaving. And what a difference it's made having her home every single night for dinner, bath, and bed, And I think like parents that prioritize those meaningful hours, and it might not be bedtime, but prioritize some hours in the day, when they look back 20 years from now, they never regret jipping work a little bit or adjusting their work, going in earlier so they could get home earlier, whatever the case might be. Usually, especially in 2023, when so much of work is virtual, like adjusting your work hours a little bit to be there for the hours that count the most for your family. Like, I don't know many guys that regret that, if any,
No. One thing that was easier for me than it is for you is I didn't have to live my life comparing myself to what every other mom and dad were doing with their kids on social media, right?
Yeah.
Now, everything you do, somebody else is putting their version of it online. And so it can be so tempting to compete. And that was one of the things that, you know, in some ways we just distinctively tried to get out of is that little, obsessive perfectionistic competition among parents. Like we're gonna be messy parents, we're gonna have messy kids, but we're gonna have grace and mercy at the center of our family, even if that meant a little bit more mess, and
Yeah.
not having to have the visuals of what everybody else is doing to get it right in their head. That just made it easier.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely can make it challenging. Especially like I've been trying to like, create more content, get it out there, help promote the podcast.
Yeah.
And I'll sit there and I'm like, I'll try one or two takes at a video and I'm like, this is not looking like how other people do it. And I'm just like, I don't know if I'm just a bad video picture person or like if they try 1,000 takes to get the right one, but I'm like, I'm not willing to do that because my kids don't care enough, and it's like, I'm not going to have them keep replaying the thing to try to get the perfect image. Like, I want them to just have fun, and so it can be really hard when you get caught up in that social media competition, so to say,
Yeah.
and lose sight of what's really important. But that didn't mean you didn't have challenges, 20 years ago. It's just different than the ones we face today. So,
Sure.
hindsight's 2020. What's something that you, looking back, wish you would have done differently?
Yeah, sure. It's actually something I've thought a lot about because as I think about men in that age 25 to 35 range, I think they are oftentimes the most important men in the life of the church. And just as a little aside, um, uh, there's some research done about 8 to 10 years ago that when a child comes to faith, there's a 3% chance that the rest of that child's family will begin coming to church with them. And when a mom comes to faith, there's about a 17% chance that the rest of the family will begin coming to church with them. When a man comes to faith, the percentage chance that the rest of the family will begin going to church with them, 93%.
It's wild.
That's like 5 to 6 times the impact of a woman, and a lot of men don't realize their impact, and so in some ways, and this is definitely oversimplifying it, but one of the most significant things that could happen in the life of any church is to get a man from holding the diaper bag, waiting for his wife to get done talking, to be the man who's engaged himself. Because when that man's faith awakens, and when he starts seeing church as a place where he has friends and that he has a place to serve, that entire family activates around him. And really the cascading impact of things like that is really hard to measure. Now, I say all that to say that like those men 25 to 35, I was one of those guys, and I do a lot of thinking about what makes a difference for them. And I know for me, there's a couple of things that hit me in that range. All of a sudden, two things in particular. I hit my limits, first of all. I hit my limits on things, and I started reacting to things. And I'll explain. When it came to my limits, I got to age 30 and I realized I just can't eat everything I wanted.
Yeah.
I found myself married and I can't just stay out as long as I wanted. I went to the basketball court and I realized that I can't run as hard as I used to, certainly if I am not keeping myself in shape. And all of a sudden, like, there's these limits I started hitting. In conflict with my wife, I realized that my emotional tank got to the bottom quicker than she did, right? And so certain things happen. I just surrender her once she outlasted me on certain issues. And so I realized I had an emotional tank, and I realized what happened when I got to the bottom of it. Uh, I realized that sort of like into my mid 30s, I experienced a bit of a burnout because I just started working I was working so hard that at some point in time when I reached down deep to get a little bit more to go do the next thing, there's nothing there. And it wasn't because I wasn't having quiet times. It wasn't because I wasn't loving God. It wasn't because I wasn't loving my wife. It wasn't because I wasn't doing the right thing. I was just doing so many things that I came to the end of myself. And so that's what it means that where I started experiencing my limitations. Now, when it came to me beginning to react, what I found is that some of what was driving me in those days were the messages I had when I was a kid. And I think this is true of me, and I think this is true of a lot of guys. Somewhere around age 15, we get the message that we're being lazy, maybe because we were playing video games for 4 hours, right? And so, there's a part of me that thinks that, like, I've spent the last 30 some years trying to prove that I'm not lazy. And so what ends up happening is that we go over the top with our sense of responsibility. We feel like we have to control this and that and the other thing. And what ends up happening is that we go over the top and so far overboard when it comes to responsibilities that we lose track of our friendships. We lose track of our fitness. We lose track of our faith. Right? And because being responsible is that sort of identity that we find ourselves in. Some of the reactions are like, hey, look, my dad was a yeller, so I'm never going to yell at my kids. But what really happens is we say, my dad was a yeller, so I'm not going to discipline my kids. Or my dad wasn't there for me, and so I'm always going to be there for my kids. And every dad wants, every good dad wants to always be there for their kids, but that in of itself can become an idol. And so we find ourselves reacting to, my reactions showed up and my limitations showed up in my 30s.
I think, what you said, so much of how we handle things, especially in this phase of life that I'm in and most of our listeners are in, we are still coming to grips with the messages we heard as kids. Because I think I probably heard that message about, the laziness thing. I think one of the ones that I've really had to work through was you can't ask for help. That's like one of those messages that somewhere along the way I picked up as a kid. And then as an adult, it's always been very hard for me to ask for help, and I try to take on so many things, and I did it at work. I do it at home. I try to take on so many because it's like, I can handle it. It's just one more thing. I can handle it. And then it's like, man, you reach that breaking point where all of a sudden everyone around you's looking like, what's wrong with KG? Like, why is he breaking down right now? And it's like, it's because I've needed help for so long, but I thought I wasn't allowed to ask for it because that's this message that I heard growing up. I internalized. Yes. It became a part of me. And it's like, I've really had to learn, and it's like, I've gotten better. I still have a long way to go in it. And Becky's very gracious. She will ask me all the time. She's like, what can I do to help? What do you need off your plate? Cause she knows that I won't ask for help unless it's like, absolute limit breaker.
Well, I think also it's not just asking for help, but it's having the permission to enjoy ourselves. Right? Christianity is the only faith that literally sets aside a day to enjoy the life that God has given us, right? But for some reason, like, we get this idea in our heads that we can't do that. And it's gotten worse. I came across this stat just this past week that in 2013, the average person spent 6.5 hours of their week with friends. The same research was done more recently, I think in 2022. That number is now 2. And
Wow.
so, I mean, that's not sociologically significant. That's radical, right? Because
Yeah.
that, when, being with friends is what gives us perspective. It gives us new ideas. It gives us a sense of, gives us a sense of ourself. It gives a sense of satisfaction to life. And when we don't get that, we have to go get it from somewhere else. Whether it's a populist means I'm on board with this movement over here,
Yeah.
or hiding in other things that just aren't as good.
Yeah. And I think it's so ingrained in us, I think, as men and as young men in particular, that we think like limits just don't apply to us.
Yeah.
And I think like I've always, like I've always been into fitness. I love taking care of myself physically. And I remember one time I was going through, just a tough season. My depression was really getting to me. And you were sitting down with me and you're like, KG, you're going to have to realize at some point in time, like your body's not perfect. Like you can't keep going. And I was like, bro, that's insulting. Like, but it's not, it's not. And my mind is not perfect. My heart is not perfect. Like there is no perfect part about me. And I think like, even now, like, all right, look 20 years ago, the most popular movies in the world, they weren't all these superhero movies where people were doing these impossible things. It's like you look at all the big blockbusters that people are watching now. It's Marvel movies, it's Star Wars movies, it's Batman and Superman. It's, and where you even have regular humans like Batman or Iron Man doing these like miraculous supernatural things. And I think like that just further adds to this idea that it's like, hey, limits are meant to be broken. And I think as guys, like we just believe that we're the exception to the rule. And we don't abide by the rule. But I think anyone with some life experience could tell you that that's not really the case. And so what do men, especially young men, need to understand about their limitations? Because I think it impacts our work, it impacts our family especially.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. Most of my pain in my 30s and 40s, I just turned 50 in last year. So most of my pain in my 30s and 40s was ignoring the messages my body was giving to me when it comes to my limitations. And so my first time I went to a counselor, the counselor says, how does your body feel when you're upset? I'm like, I don't even understand the question. What do you mean? I'm just upset. No. Like, what does your body tell you when you're getting frustrated or disappointed? I'm like, my body does not talk to me, buddy. I don't know what you're talking about. But he was way ahead of me on this, and that like our bodies do communicate to us. And when there's a sense of exhaustion or fear or things like that, it doesn't mean we need to give in to the fear and change our circumstances, but it does mean we need to note it and understand where we need courage, or where there's exhaustion, where do we find rest. So for me, I didn't listen to those limitations. And I think understanding those limitations as given to us from God for us. I was looking closely at Psalm 139 this past week, and it's a beautiful psalm about how God has created us. And one of the verses in there, I only noticed it more recently. It says, "You hem me in before and behind." That God made us limited people. And the original sin is wanting to be unlimited, wanting to be like God, right? And so receiving those limitations as a gift. For example, I mentioned the Sabbath. Sabbath is a gift for us to live well-rested lives, to live lives that enjoy one another. It puts a limit on how much we work. It puts a limit on how much we are called to bear. Now, back in the day when people were celebrating the Sabbath, they wouldn't work on the Sabbath, and they would know that their community would have less food for it. So Sabbath and enjoyment is an act of trust, is an act of hope. And I have found when it comes to when it comes to this is the couple things that a few different things help me on this. Thinking in a sabbatical way of things. Like there aren't things that are entirely there's some things. It's not like, okay, I'm just going to put a limit on my pornography. No, like pornography is wrong. Don't do pornography. But most of the problems that guys in their 30s are struggling with is the abundance of good things, right? I have got my work, which is good. I've got my service in the community or church, which is good. I've got my family, which is good. And the whole like, well, I got my priorities straight, God, family, work. Well, that doesn't help you at 4:45 when something needs to get done at work and your spouse needs you at home, right? And how do you sort that out, right? So the two things that have helped me is to thinking in a sabbatical way of things, knowing that like, hey, everything has its limitations, and creating space for other things is really helpful. The second thing that's helped me is to understand that God has called me to different channels of life, and those channels will oftentimes be in conflict with each other. Good things. My problem isn't, my early 30s wasn't like staying away from the red Solo cup. That's what a 19-year-old's struggling with. If you're still struggling with that at 31, we've got groups for you. But at 31, most guys are, what I'm struggling with, how do I manage all these good things? And so I'm called to a certain vocation. I'm called to be a spouse. For those who have kids, I'm called to have kids. I'm called to serve in my church and in my community. And all of those things, some of them have to be front burner sometimes, some of them have to be back burner. We had a season in our family where we had moved and I had started a new job, and Kathleen was just going through a really, really difficult time. And I just knew, and as we were talking about this, my work, I had to just do my work with my left hand. Like you've played basketball with me, and if I'm dribbling, trying to beat you with my left hand, you're not going to have much trouble, right? Because my home life needed my right hand, right? Didn't mean that I wasn't giving work its full due, but like my prayer life, my best energies were going towards home. And then there's certain times where work just needs that extra push. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring home life, but it's one of those things where wisdom is sorting out the good things in the moment and figuring them out without getting into these all or nothing. I'm all about the family. Well, you're also called to make this world better beyond your family. So what about church? What about your work? What about your integrity and your character, right? Just stabbing at, making your life one-dimensional is, well, that's the thing that's taken away from you oftentimes in your 30s, right? When you start having these multiple channels of calling start to show up.
Yeah. Because it also benefits your kids to be able to see you making the world a better place in these different areas. And yeah, I mean, I think most of the guys, like, if your biggest struggle at 30 is the red Solo cup, you're probably not listening to this podcast, right? Like, this probably isn't the podcast. You're probably not listening to many podcasts, but especially this one. If you're listening to this, it's like you want to be a good dad. Yes. And there's this saying going around right now that parenting is only hard for good parents. And I absolutely love that, because I'm like, first of all, it makes me feel good because I'm like, parenting is really hard, man. If you sit there and tell me that raising kids is easy, I'm like, I don't know how you do it, because I feel like I'm doing an okay job at it, but it is hard, man. And the parenting's, it's only hard for good parents. And I love what you said about limits being a gift from God. We don't think of it like that. But God also gave us the Sabbath as a gift. And it can be hard, man. Me and my wife will joke. We'll say like, so when do we take a Sabbath? When we got little kids, like, when do we take that? Because they are always work, and so it can be really, really hard to get that time to actually rest and enjoy life. And that is a shocking statistic that you shared too about, 10 years ago, people spent an average of 6 or 7 hours a week with friends, and now they spend an average of 2. And I even look at my life and I'm like, man, I don't even know if I get 2 hours a week in with friends like that,
Yeah, yeah.
And most of my really close friends don't live in proximity. And I think that's part of the awkward part too for a lot of people is, like we live here in Indy now. Becky's now in geographically closer to her 2 best friends, but I'm further away from mine. But it's like we got things like texting, me and Anthony, we play Xbox together all the time. Just that's like our way of catching up
but that counts
is hanging out, playing some video games. And so I think like, hey, this, I think like, hey, it used to be like video games make you lazy. And it's like, no, actually they could be a great way to connect if we view them as a proper tool for connection. But, most listeners of this podcast, like I said, they're not battling the solo cup thing. They're not, battling being out partying all weekend. They're battling, how do I balance all of these good, like God has blessed me with all of these good things. How do I balance them all? And maybe balance is a myth. Because like you said, I think sometimes it's like, hey, certain things are going to take over in certain seasons, and I think that's where being a team with your spouse is so important. Because when you're on the same page about things, you can say like, hey, you've got it crazy at work right now. I'll hold down the fort here. Or it might be vice versa. Like, hey, you have time and space to be able to hold down the fort a little bit more. While I've got this crazy season at work going on.
And that's actually where the understanding of a sense of calling has been really helpful to me. Because when it comes to balance, if balance is the goal, my comfort becomes the center.
Wow.
So, but when it's calling, I know that God has called me to live a well-rested life. God has called me to steward my body well. God has called me to love my wife. God has not called me to make my wife happy. It's a really important distinction, right? Because if I'm only trying to make my wife happy, then that's about me, right? Because if you're not happy, then I'm not happy, right? No, God's called me to love her, right? And same thing with our kids. It's tempting to always want our kids to, their life to always be to go up and to the right and always feel good about every single moment. That's not my calling. My calling is to raise them to be citizens and to walk with God and to do justly. And that means I need to expose them to hard things. I need to see them fail. I want them to fail in my presence now so they learn to access grace later, because they're going to fail later and life's only going to be harder. And if I don't allow them to experience those difficulties now. And so that's why when I start looking at each of these channels regarding God's calling, then I have a sense of direction that's bigger than me, that's bigger than my comfort. And frankly, it's better than me. And it's better than my comfort. Kathleen has this great phrase that I think is, I love it. And she uses this anytime we can't give our kids what we want to, or they experience failure that's rooted in us, like we didn't get a form filled out or this, that, the other, and they have to pay for our mistake or whatever. She'll say, you are now one step closer to being a well-balanced adult, right? Because now they're experiencing real life. But when it's rooted into a sense of calling, then I can begin arranging my life, not according to, Stephen Covey, the 7 practices of highly effective people, or what I see on Instagram, but in the scriptures and in the wisdom as to, hey, how is a life well lived? What's a direction that I could offer people, or that I can offer my family that's bigger than me and my own preferences?
Yeah. We want to do so much for our kids. We want to give them the world. We don't want them to experience hurt. We don't want them to experience disappointment. We don't want them to experience bullying. But I love what you say, like, allow them to fail in my presence
Yes.
so that they can experience disappointment, they can experience grace. Because it's like you're going to be disappointed in life through no fault of your own. Like, that's just life. Just somebody else messed up. You know, I think like just this morning, Thursdays are my basketball days, and so I get together with a group of guys that play basketball at 5:30 in the morning, right? Which is like an ungodly hour for some people, but it's like we get like 15 guys every single week that show up to play ball at 5:30 a.m. and we'll play for about 2 hours. We all showed up this morning, and we rent from a church here locally, gym space. We show up, and they had like this garage sale set up in the gym.
They never tell the basketball guys. They always forget about the basketball guys.
We're always forgotten. And I'm sitting there like, a little heads up would have been nice before we woke up at 5 a.m. to come here. You know, and it's like we're disappointed we didn't get to run, but we're more disappointed that we lost a couple hours of sleep.
Yes.
Like we woke up my alarm goes off at 4:40 on Thursdays to get up, get out the door, wake up a little bit and get there to hoop. Like through no fault of our own. Like we paid the rent. We're supposed to have access. Somebody else dropped the ball and didn't let us know, you know? But it's like you're going to experience disappointment because of someone else's failure. And so it's like allowing your kids to experience that while they're still in your home, they're still in your presence, so you can walk with them through that is a huge, huge benefit. And it helps you stay within your limits, because you will go beyond your limits trying to keep your kids from ever experiencing pain. Because it's an impossible task, and you will bust through your limits if you try to do that. And it's not even beneficial to them.
Well, and if you make them the center, then they will think they're the center.
Yup.
Right. And they, you know, our kids need to see us live for something bigger than ourselves, and something that restrains us from their own happiness. Because if they're going to embrace delayed gratification, if they're going to embrace something bigger than themselves, the first thing they're going to think of, well, what was bigger than me growing up? What was bigger than my dad growing up? And when they see us embrace something bigger than ourselves, man, it gives them a path to walk in that enables them to go past us, which is the goal anyway, right? We want them to go beyond us, not stay with us.
Yeah. So most guys listening are probably relating to this a lot, because we feel, even if we haven't felt like we've crashed into our limits, most probably have, we can sense that like there's a wall somewhere in some area of life. Like there's a wall and we're butting up against it and we can't figure out how to overcome it. And maybe it's because we're not meant or created to overcome it. Right? So what is the risk and reward of ignoring our limitations? Right?
Yeah.
Like I think you and I, like we're on different wavelengths of risks. Like you're just like, and this was like something when we worked together, it was like, Mark's like, oh, let's just go for it. And I'm like, ooh, like let's count the cost of this, right? Because I'm a very calculated risk taker, right? Which might mean like I'm not a very risky person. What is the risk and reward of ignoring our limitations?
What I'll talk about the risk side of it, because I certainly just needed to find out. Like I'm like, okay, I feel a limit. And in my foolishness, I'm like, well, let's just find out what happens if I just keep going. And that's sort of how I roll with life and a lot of things. And what I found on the other side of my limits was anxiety, and depression, and disconnection from my meaningful relationships, and shame. Right. Once you begin moving beyond your limits, your mind literally, you lose. Shame starts kicking in, and your mind starts fragmenting. Your relationships start fragmenting. You start distancing yourself from other folks, and more fear kind of kicks in, partly because you're functioning outside of God's care and protection, which is just a scary place to be. And so those were a couple of the personal things I experienced. Um, other things you can get into is debt, right? Because if you need everybody to be happy, then you don't have the ability. If happiness of others and peace in the household is the number one thing, you're going to go beyond your limits when it comes to finances, right? And all of a sudden debt starts kicking in. Uh, you know, you start gaining weight, and and your health begins to suffer. And I don't actually begrudge that much, because in some regards, I don't mind the 10 pounds I picked up in the first 10 years, right? Because that staying at my college weight wasn't the number one goal. Loving my family, my kids, and that's sort of where I had to balance the calling type things out. Um, I think the first thing that goes for a lot of men is our friendships. And the friendships are the things, and when you risk the friendships, they're the thing. There's where you experience new ideas. That's where you get a sense of accountability. That's where you get a sense of perspective. And once that happens, and you see this happen to folks when they get old, their lives begin telescoping, and they can only see they only see a limited amount of things. Like they can only see how their 401k is doing. They can only see, how their wife is performing in one certain way, right? They can only see how their career is going, and your life begins shrinking when you ignore the relationships around you. All right, so that's the risk. Here's the reward of honoring your limitations. When I've honored my limitations, I stop thinking about how I can expand when it comes to breath. And what ends up happening is I stay where I'm at, and I've been able to go deeper there and create depth to my life, right? Like I can enjoy a simple Friday night at home. I don't have to go be amazing. I don't have to take my wife out for the most amazing date. I don't have to go out and spend money. I can enjoy the life God's given me without spending money, right? When I embrace my limitations, what ends up happening is I'm not trying to go out there to get something. I begin seeing the goodness of what I have right in front of me, and you could say that you can look at that and say, well, is that just mediocrity? If you don't do anything about it, it becomes mediocrity. But when you engage the smaller space you've been given, your character begins forming in depth. You create space for genuine relationships that have depth. You give up the notion that you're going to know everybody in your senior class, but you pick up those 4 or 5 guys that you're going to run deeply with, and all of a sudden you guys have folks who know you, understand you, and are there for you. When you stop trying to do everything, make everyone happy, you actually have time to start processing all that stuff from your past that you've been reacting to. When you stop trying to expand and accomplish everything now, you have space to feel your disappointments, feel your frustrations, learn what it feels like when your body and heart and mind starts hitting those walls. And when you hit those walls, those walls don't become speed bumps that you ignore over time. They actually become opportunities to learn and become wiser and have a sense of depth that you wouldn't have had before. That's just a couple of rewards that I have found. Now it took me to my 40s before I'm like, all right, I need to start listening to this.
Yeah.
But man, and it was really painful, and I was really frustrated. But I'm so grateful for the folks who've come in to help me see these limitations, not as speed bumps, not as obstacles, but as messages of grace that can help me learn and grow, become more wise.
Yeah. I think a word in listening to you talk about that, a word that comes to my mind is peace. And I think when we learn to live within our limits, we have peace. And you might say, like, well, you just said, like, it's not about you being comfortable. That's not the same thing. I think peace is very different. And the Bible talks about, God will give us a peace that surpasses understanding. And it is something that I've had to learn and continue to learn, is to live within my limits. And as I've done that, I've experienced more and more peace. Because it goes back to that calling thing you talked about, where it's like, hey, no, we don't have the most comfortable, like, we're not in the biggest house, we don't drive the fanciest cars, like, none of that, like, but I am at peace with a lot of things in my life right now, because I believe that I am exactly where God has called me to be, doing the exact things that God has called me to do, in being home, raising my boys, in doing this podcast, in doing, what I need to do outside of the house to help bring in money to make the math work in our finances. And in taking care of my body, not to this extreme limit where I'm working out 20 hours a week, but it's like, hey, I'm doing the things necessary to take care of myself so I feel at my best, so I can roughhouse with my boys 10 hours a day. Even though I feel exhausted, but I feel a peace because I've learned to respect my limits. And it's not about the comfort, because there's a lot of things, like, I could go out and I could work harder and try to earn more money for our house to live a more comfortable life, but that would disrupt the peace that we have in our family right now. There's a different thing. It's like the peace that I'm talking about is this peace that God gives you, that it goes beyond your understanding. Like, it doesn't really make sense. However, because we are in the line with the calling that I believe God has placed on our family right now in this season, like, we're experiencing that peace in our family.
Well, and when you're there, when I allow my limitations to hem me in before and behind, I can start finding my identity in who I am, who God made me to be, versus this other thing out there, whether it's achieving this or doing this or this thing out there. And when that begins happening, I begin to think about the kind of person I want to be in the space I am, right? Fitness, fitness when you turn 50 isn't about, there's only so much I could do to make my body look any better, right? So it can't be about that. But when I realize it's about, expanding my capacity to love, expanding my ability to be there for my family, my grandkids in the long haul, if that ever happens, that changes the whole thing, because it's not about what I look about like on the outside, which I'm not necessarily going to complain about, but the heart of it all of a sudden becomes, what kind of person am I going to be? Am I going to be healthy? And am I going to be the kind of guy that shows up when the moment matters most?
Well, and it allows you to get out there and throw baseballs with your kids' team.
Yeah.
And
like, I'm so grateful for that. Yeah.
Right. And it's like, that's what it's about. Like, it's not about getting the abs. It's not about it's like, it's about me being able to be there and do this thing with my kid. And, going to work and working a job, it's not about like, oh, how much money can I bring in so I could get the bigger house, I could get the nicer car, I could get the cooler sneakers. It's about, hey, God has created me to improve this world in some capacity. And yeah, I bring in an income from that because you need money to live. Like, money is not evil. That's a common misconception.
No, it's good.
But like, it becomes about more than just your paycheck. It becomes about the impact, not just the income. And all these things can bring you peace, even if it's like, hey, I might not be making as much as that guy over there, but that guy over there might be in debt up to his eyeballs. He might be stressed out to the max. He might be losing sleep. Like, we don't know what's going on the other side of Instagram that we can't see when we're only seeing their highlight reel. Like, we don't know what's really going on beneath the surface. And it might be going great for them. I hope it is. We don't know. When we get into comparing, that's where we try to bust those limits that God intended for our good, for our benefit. And so I love that. I love that idea that, like, hey, these limits were not meant to be a curse, but a blessing. in
Right.
your life. And acknowledging and living within those limits allows you to take that rest. Whereas if we didn't have limits, like we wouldn't rest. If we didn't have limits, we might not stop to enjoy the things that God has blessed us with in this life, because we would just need to keep going because there's always more that we can do. And so learning like, hey, these limits exist allows us to say like, hey, I've reached my limit. Like, let's stop and rest. And I love one of the things that you said when I was working with 938 was, I want to make sure I say it right, is we work from rest. We don't
Yes.
rest from work. And
Yes.
that was a
No.
big paradigm shift for me, of making that distinction there.
Yeah. And it's a radical concept that really has to be unlearned, right? Uh,
Yeah.
One of
Yeah.
my favorite books of recent years is by John Mark Comer, The
Mm.
Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. But in doing that it's enabled me to be better in the moment, right? And to when I see myself hurrying, that is not a sign of my importance, which I used to say, I
Mm.
think. It's not a
Mm.
sign of my importance. It's a sign of my lack of discipline. And so
Mm.
when I start seeing myself that way and starting to see myself as a well-rested, wise, strong person in Christ that never needs to hurry, man, that changed the game for me.
Yeah. I think this has been such a rich conversation, and I think so applicable because I think most of the guys that are listening to this, they're trying to figure out how to balance all the good things in their life. They're trying to be a good dad, trying to be a good employee, trying to be a good husband, trying to be a good friend. And it's just a lot. It's a lot. And we're trying to figure out how to balance it all and deal with those limitations. So what what can we do? What are some steps men can take to follow and honor our limits?
Uh, I'll say two things. Um, Learning to articulate them well.
Mm.
So for me, I I I have a journal that I use faithfully or regularly. I don't write in it every day, but I'll write out the prayers of where I'm feeling pain points, and it takes the amorphous experience of pain and it puts it into words. And when I'm brought into the presence of God, it gives me perspective of those things. So write it out.
Mm.
Articulate your emotional experience, your physical experience. And then, because once things get out of your head and into the light, they're less intimidating, they're less scary.
Mm.
And the second thing is find the dudes you want to be like and be around them.
Mm. That's
Uh, one of my
huge.
one of my best friends is just a man of discipline, of wisdom, of discretion, and and I've always wanted to be a bit more like him. And we talk regularly. Andy Stanley famously says, your friends will determine the quality and direction of your life. And so think about, okay, what's at some level, when it comes to your career, you want to find the people who are where you want to get to and start talking to them. But I would say more importantly, who are those men 5, 10, 20 years down the road whom you want to be like? And buy them coffee. Just say, I just want to ask a question. Like, hey, tell me your story. Just learn to ask questions of people who have been down the road ahead of you. And buy them a cup of coffee once a month, or find a small group to be in with guys who are kind of working through those sorts of things. Find those men and just do whatever it takes to be around them and let their influence impact you.
Yeah. That's huge. And I think it's so easy to surround ourselves with our peers that are kind of going through
Yes.
the same thing. And we need those relationships in our life. We need people that are in the same phase of life. But one thing I've always tried to do that I'm proud of is try to have men in different seasons of life ahead of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never, I've gone up to a number of guys that have been successful in different areas of life over, the last 10 or so years. And I've said, like, hey, I really appreciate and love the way that you do this. Can I buy you coffee or can I buy you breakfast and just hear more about that? I've never been turned down.
No.
And often they end up buying me the breakfast anyway. But like, like I've gotten to sit down with some amazing people and learn from them. Because I think, like, hey, if you go up, like, if you want to be great in this area of business and you see someone that's in their 50s or 60s that's great in that area, if you go up as a 30-year-old and say, like, hey, I love the way that you do this, can I buy you coffee and learn about that? Dude, they're going to jump at that because they see you as someone that's willing to learn. And in their limited time, they're not willing to spend time with younger guys that aren't willing to learn.
Nope.
But they are willing to make time for guys that are eager to learn more. And so I've never been turned down from those kind of opportunities with people. And they're some of the best conversations and have helped shape me into who I am today. So I absolutely love that tip there.
Well, bro, I tell guys my age, find guys who are younger than you that you want to be like as well. And KG, I consider you one of those men.
I appreciate that. That means a lot. Well, Mark, thank you so much for jumping on here. Honored to have you on the podcast. We've done a lot of stuff together, but this one's a newer one.
This is a lot of fun.
So this was good, man. Thanks so much for joining in. I think it's a conversation that'll benefit a lot of guys. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed tuning into that conversation and listening in. Just want to give y'all a heads up. Starting next episode, and for many episodes following that, man, we are jumping into some tough topics, but essential topics. When we talk about helping men win in marriage and parenting, there's some hard things that we got to talk about because there are some roadblocks, some barriers that are trying to keep men from being the healthiest version of themselves. And so we're going to be talking about it. We're going to be talking about the problems. We're going to be trying to offer some solutions. Not that we have all the answers figured out, but a lot of the guests that we have coming up and a lot of the content over the next couple months is going to be geared around some of these really big issues that men face that, frankly, I don't think enough people are talking about. There are people talking about them, but it's not getting enough news. And so I think we need to be another voice in that to help men find and get to their healthiest place. And so we hope you'll continue tuning in. Share the podcast with a friend that might be going through some of these similar struggles. Let's make a difference in the lives of men, helping people get to their healthiest place for their own sake and for the sake of their families. So until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your family. This is Kicks and Minivans.